I was listening last month to a BBC documentary on the radio that was interviewing a Syrian doctor who had fled the fighting in Aleppo. He and his family had found refuge in Paris, but now he was returning to Aleppo to help those still under siege as part of a medical team. While at the clinic, he met this 14-year-old boy. His home and his town had been shelled by Syrian government forces. He'd lost his mother, his sister, and his younger brother. And he lost his legs and his knees down. But one of the first questions he asked the doctor was, when could he go back to school? Because he liked school. Now, education is the keystone to any community. A former slave in Missouri with a famous name called George Washington Carver said that it was the key to unlocking the golden door to freedom, when Nelson Mandela called it, it was powerful enough to change the world. Now, we all know how important education is. Parents consider it the most important gift that they can bestow on their children. Many societies, or in fact most societies, enshrine education into their constitution as a fundamental human right. But I can tell you that that right has been denied to 4 million Syrian children just a day's drive away from here, who for the last 4 years have been receiving intermittent education at best and at worst, none at all. Imagine this, if you were in middle school and you're just at the end of it, just in 2011 when the Syrian crisis broke out, you've just missed high school. What's that going to do to your future? What's that going to do to Syrian society? And a mother was quoted in the UN report as trying to get her child into 3rd grade. She was now nearly 8, going on 9. Couldn't find a school for her because she was a refugee. She eventually found a place in grade 1. That child can now write the letter B and the number 1. This neglect of children is a crime. What societies are doing to these people is a crime. Now, societies are built up over time. Governing institutions are created. Mechanisms are put in place to hold decision makers to account. Routes are carved up to allow citizens access to the decision-making process. And a strong media is put in place to scrutinize those in power. But I would argue one of the most important keystones to any society is the educational opportunities it provides its citizens, particularly its young. If you were to get rid of that, what becomes a society? And over the next few minutes, I hope to highlight the plight of these poor Syrian children who cannot wait. Their education cannot wait. Syrian society cannot wait. And I'll do it by asking 3 key questions. How bad is it? Will it get any worse? And what can be done? Well, how bad is it? There are 6.5 million people that have been displaced because of the conflict in Syria. 2/3 of those are children. There are 3 million people outside of Syria, refugees, half of those are children. The neighboring countries have taken in millions of refugees. Lebanon has taken in over 1 million, Jordan has 750,000, Turkey about 600,000, Iraq about 250,000, and Egypt has taken about 140,000. Now all these children, or most of these children that arrive, are now not receiving any formal education. And this is particularly true in both formal and informal camps. And they idle their days away, kicking around the dirt, with no structured learning activities available. And their parents are getting more and more frustrated and angry, watching their children's futures ebb away day after day. And children that don't go to school, particularly in these camps, are also vulnerable to exploitation and to abuse. They either get married early, they find jobs, or they join the armed groups as child soldiers. These families face huge financial pressure as refugees. Where are they getting the money for? One 17-year-old Syrian girl saw that her mum was really trying to earn money for the family, and she said she was going to help out by getting married herself. She knew it was the wrong decision. She wanted to stay in school, but there were many suitors, and she believed this would be the quickest and most efficient way of getting money for the family. The last thing she said in this report was she hoped that her husband would allow her to finish school. Many boys of school-going age go to work. Boys between the ages of 8 and 15 in the UN report, and also Human Rights Watch have produced one, are up in northern Syria working in the local diesel market. They spend 8 hours a day with sponges, soaking up the oil that has been dropped by passing tankers, and they're squeezing it into jerry cans. And for that, they get $1 a day. And that is enough for them to give up their education. And that is enough for them to feed their families. But a lot of these reports, particularly from Human Rights and Amnesty International, are more worried about child soldiers. With the growing myriad of armed groups coming up because of the Syrian crisis, they are attracting and recruiting young boys with promises of work and education and food. But when you ask these boys, what was your education like? It was prayer, religious instruction, military tactics, and weapons training. One boy called Riyadh said that he would get extra food the better his target practice was, and he could bring it home to his family. But there are groups of people that are lucky enough, in one sense, to get into UN schools or to schools run by NGOs. But these people and these children suffer from high levels of anxiety, from living in rough conditions, being displaced, and coming out of conflict. And the psychological and psychosocial distress is huge, particularly on their learning, because it's the same part of the brain where learning takes place. They are also met with unfamiliar curricula, and the language of instruction they don't understand. One teacher has said that these students are on edge. Any noise will set them off. There was one teacher in a human rights report said that if the doors banged loudly, that the children would start screaming. Then these children will drop out of school, get jobs, get married, or join as a child soldier. But if they did survive that, then they're faced with bullying. Bullying by the local children who don't want them there, who see them as parasites and taking their places in school. Then they drop out. The point is that the deck is stacked against these Syrian children. Not only have they fled the country, but now they're not wanted in their host country. Now, the physical destruction of buildings, of course, is a huge impediment to providing access to education. But I would argue that it's the psychological and the psychosocial distress that will affect their ability to learn and to develop academically into the future that is the most worrying. So, will it get any worse? Well, the short answer is yes. If the fighting continues, if we don't engage, if the global community doesn't engage, civil society will be further destroyed, social cohesion will be shattered, economic hardship will grow, violence and rape in the camps will increase. Now, the UN report, year after year, that the numbers fleeing Syria increased. In 2012 alone, there was a 10,000, in 2012 alone, there was a tenfold increase in the number of child refugees. And these neighbouring countries cannot cope with what is classed as the largest displacement of people since World War II. All these children coming into their education system, which is already underfunded and creaking. The Lebanese education system can cater for up to 300,000 children. Lebanon has already taken in 400,000 Syrian children. But it's not a case of just, as these countries are trying to cope, they're trying to bring in more legal barriers to stem the flow. But these legal and administrative barriers further create a problem. How can you expect a refugee, before they flee conflict, to apply for a visa from the Syrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or to get their grades attested by the Department of Education? They don't have this documentation. Much of the documentation is left behind as they flee for their lives. I would also argue that the geopolitical situation is getting worse. More and more groups are getting involved in the fray. as the activities of ISIS have shown. Jordan has recently hopped off the fence. President Assad, he started off as being the biggest problem. Now it's ISIS. Now, according to the UN representative on Syria, President Assad is now part of the solution. Just to tell you how messed up I think the whole thing is becoming, is the West is now helping ISIS. I was surprised to learn this. The West is now helping ISIS. Well, the West helps fund the Iraqi government so they can pay their civil servants. As more and more of Iraq comes under ISIS control, well, they have to pay the civil servants anyway. So what happens is that a representative from the Iraqi government leaves Baghdad every month with a big bag of money, goes into an ISIS-controlled territory, and hands it over to an ISIS commander, who can take up to 40% off the top. So the West are funding and fighting ISIS at the same time. Now, if history teaches us anything, bad leadership causes chaos. And history also shows us that people do change sides. Countries suddenly come together, which they were enemies, and they join together in the face of a bigger common threat. But even for this conflict, it's created incredible bedfellows. Suddenly you have a situation where Iraq is being supported by Iran. Turkey aids PKK. The US is talking to Iran. And Saudi, as usual, is kind of playing all sides. But history also tells us that conflicts do end. And we pick ourselves up, and we pick up the pieces and rebuild brick by brick. Aid agencies have got involved in the conflict too. We always say that how good a job they do. But do they? There's a growing argument to say that aid agencies actually prolong conflict. And I tell a lie, it's not that old. It goes back as far as Florence Nightingale in the 1850s during the Crimean War, when she was heavily involved in the Red Cross. And as we are seeing over the past conflicts, that aid agencies allow governments to shirk their responsibilities for the chaos they cause, because they are feeding and housing the refugees. The camps that they set up, as was the case in Somalia in '93 and also in the '90s in Yugoslavia, allow militants to find safe haven, to regroup and recruit, and then go back and continue the fighting. So my argument would be that it is now impossible for aid agencies to remain neutral. They are part of the conflict. But one of the founders of the Red Cross, Red Crescent, was Henri Dunant. And he said, the higher cost of the war, the shorter it will be and the earlier it will finish. So my question is, how high a price will Syria have to pay? How high will the cost be? Now, even if you agree with the aid agency argument that they prolong the conflict, surely we can do nothing. Yes, we still have to do something while we wait for the political and military solutions to emerge. So what can be done? Well, I would argue that we should increase, target, and sustain the funding. The UN report again said that about $1 million would provide enough education for all the children that need it. But here's the rub. Funding for humanitarian disaster relief is actually going down worldwide, while the numbers needing it is rising. I was surprised to find out that out of the $8.3 billion that is generated for aid worldwide, the education sector gets 2%, which is $162 million. This is nothing. Now, the UN have called for this to be doubled to 4%. And despite all the appeals and all the mentions of lost generations, what have donor countries done? They not only haven't reached the target of 4%, the 2% has dropped down to 1.75%. One of the other biggest barriers to education was the legal and administrative costs. Remember I was saying that a lot of these people don't have the documentation needed. Very often, countries look for teacher certification, and they cannot cope in a language that is not their own. So I would say, get rid of teacher certification. Allow Syrian teachers who are also fleeing the conflict to set up Syrian schools in these neighboring countries to teach the Syrian curriculum in the Syrian language to the Syrian children, at least on a temporary basis. And finally, I would say that force, cajole, convince richer countries to take more refugees. These neighboring countries can no longer cope with the burden, which, as I said, is one of the biggest migration of people since the Second World War because of conflict. At the moment, countries outside of the neighboring countries only take 1.7% of the refugees. Amnesty International have led a group of organizations, 30 in all, to say, let's get that to 5% by the end of this year. But the report is particularly scathing of the Gulf states, who have offered to take none. And they consider them both linguistically, religiously, and culturally in the best place and should be at the forefront of offering refuge to these Syrian refugees that are fleeing conflict and war crimes. So to conclude, we shouldn't be naive enough to think that there's an easy solution to civil conflict or civil unrest. And we shouldn't be naive enough to think that this will be the last. And we shouldn't even be naive enough to think that people power alone will stop this. But we should be wise enough to know that conflicts do end. And we should be angry enough to leave this auditorium today and tell anybody that will listen what is happening to these children. In the long term, sure, we need to rebuild the civil institutions. We need to sign a new social contract. And we need to open access to the decision-making processes, because it is disenfranchised, economically depressed, powerless people that cause conflict and civil unrest. But for now, we must help these children. For now, we must focus our immediate attention, because as the director of UNICEF, Anthony Lake, said only last month, millions of children inside Syria and across the region are witnessing their past and their futures disappear amidst the rubble and destruction of this prolonged conflict. We must rescue them from the brink, for their sake and for the sake of Syria and future generations. Thank you.
We would firstly like to thank you all for coming out today. It was great seeing everyone, family and friends.
We hope that you had a good time and hopefully learned something new from our talented group of speakers. We have a lot of people to thank, so let's get started. We would first like to thank Mr. Hardin. We would like to thank Ms. McFarlane for her enthusiastic effort, Mr. Schaffner, Mr. McMahon, Mr. Dougie, Mr. Raj, tech support for their exhaustive efforts in making sure that everything runs smoothly, DAPA for their generous contributions, Studio K, Ms. Jardin, and Mr. Smith.
Not to mention Ms. Ritchie, Mr. Carey, Ms. Kodita, Mr. Stevens, and Ms. Munn for being such great teacher coaches. Our speakers will be forever grateful. Ahmed Mukaid for all the fabulous portraits and taking pictures even today. Alyana De Vera for her help with the TEDx promotional video, which was absolutely phenomenal. As well as Baha Fresh and Bakio Gelato for providing all this great food.
TED has been an amazing experience this year, and everyone has worked incredibly hard to put this event together. And seeing the success of today really reflects all the hard work that's been put in by all of the members from the TED Club. And on behalf of the entire TED team, I would like to congratulate all of the speakers for doing such an amazing job. We're so proud of you, and you should be of yourselves as well.
TEDx is my personal favorite event, as all the talks are so varied, yet all talks are equally as relevant. Me and Ragini intensely look forward to making next year's TEDx event even better. Thank you.
Also, we would like to have a big round of applause for Mr. Rogers, who really kept us on track this year and made today's event happen.
I would also like to thank Prem Segal, Natalia Rahman, and Sarah Sadani for being such great heads and for making this possible. Thank you.